So let's see. All right. Okay, I think we're up. Can you see my screen, everyone?
You are good. Yep.
Okay,
Yes.
great. All right, awesome. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here. And thank you for inviting me here to talk to you a little bit about this important but somewhat elusive topic of women in the Haitian Revolution. So I want to just kind of start off by talking about how I, became interested in this issue, and and so when I first was starting out as a graduate student, I had learned of a woman named Cecile Fatiman, who was a Mambo voodoo priestess and who led the Bois Caiman ceremony 1 week prior to the insurrection of 1791. From there, I knew that I wanted to explore the role of women in religion in the Haitian Revolution. But as I became familiarized with some of the literature in the field and spoke to some expert scholars, it seemed that there were no real archival records on or written by women revolutionaries. So there seems to have been kind of a somewhat of a lack of serious scholarship dedicated to the experience of enslaved women in colonial Haiti, at least in the English language, I'll say that. I know there's been some things written in French by people like Arlette Gautier. Um, but in English, at least, a full-length doctoral dissertation or a book about women in the Haitian Revolution has not yet been written. So during my graduate study, I ended up deciding to turn my attention to studying Maroons or runaway slaves and their activities leading up to the revolution. But I've maintained an interest in women in colonial Haiti and their significance in the revolutionary process. So even though we might not really have a full book written about women just yet, there's still a knowledge and an understanding, especially among Haitian people, about the centrality and importance of women in Haitian history and in contemporary society. So the image that you're seeing here on the right is a picture of a Haitian 10 Goud banknote from 2004. Which was the 200th anniversary of the Haitian Declaration of Independence. So this currency prominently figures a woman named Sanit Belair. Sanit was executed in October of 1802 alongside her husband, Charles Belair, and she was noted for her fearlessness and refusal to be blindfolded during the execution. I think that this banknote is an example of how women in the Haitian Revolution indeed are remembered today, albeit in ways that might require unique methods of analysis to comprehend. So today I want to talk a little bit about elaborating on the things that I've just mentioned. Let's see. Okay, here we go. First, I'll discuss some of the reasons for the silences in the archives and in the literature about women in the Haitian Revolution. Then I'll turn to some perspectives that can help us fill in those gaps and create a broader picture of what women's experiences were and what their contributions most likely looked like during the revolutionary process. Then I'll discuss a few women who are noted in the archival histories of the Haitian Revolution, the various roles they played, and the ways that we can use this knowledge to better understand and center women today. Okay. So scholars like Haitian anthropologist Michelle Rolfe-Trio, historian Marisa Fuentes, and professor of English Sadia Hartman have brought our attention to the mechanics of how history is written based on the things that historical archives do and do not say. So we have to understand that most of the remaining records about the transatlantic slave trade, about colonialism in the Americas, enslavement in the Americas, and even enslaved people's resistance actions derive from account books, slave rosters, runaway advertisements, travelers' accounts, and plantation records that upheld the bureaucratic and managerial dimensions of slavery. So these records reflect and are deeply embedded in slave owners and slave traders' financial interest in slavery and their racist biases and ways of thinking about Black people. The enslaved people's patterns of resistance is one area where archival documents are often intentionally biased against those who were attempting to free themselves from bondage and oppression. And since most enslaved people did not leave behind records of their own, their intentionality or the ways that they understood and navigated the world and their attempts to free themselves are not fully represented in those archival documents. Similarly, women, enslaved women especially, were written out of archives as well as their fullest expressions of themselves, their modes of being, and their forms of resistance. And part of this is also linguistic as well, because, I guess in French, when there is a group of male and female entities or nouns that are in action together or just assembled together, the French plural pronoun automatically goes to the masculine. So even linguistically, there's kind of a silencing of women's presence when they are amongst men, or male nouns, female nouns when they're amongst male nouns. So enslaved women not only faced the horrors of slavery as racialized beings, they also contended with a gendered oppression and exploitation, and therefore were relegated to the most labor-intensive work and were marginalized from spheres of formally recognized power. These silences represent the violence of colonialism and racial slavery that aimed to quell any dissent to social orders that relied on Black subjugation. So there are difficulties in recovering the narratives of women during the Haitian Revolution. But part of the work that I do and that many others do is to either read through, across, or against the grain of these records in order to tell the stories that enslavers never wanted to have told. So as an African diaspora studies scholar, it's important to approach the topic of women in colonial Haiti by first centering Africa and Africans. The transatlantic slave trade involuntarily transported over 11 million African people to European colonies of the Americas, and approximately 8 to 900,000 of these Africans were taken to colonial Haiti on French ships. You may have heard that Haiti was a particularly deadly slave colony where the enslaved population was literally worked to death and was unable to reproduce itself. In addition to the, violence and brutality, the material conditions themselves were just unsustainable. So in order to replace the enslaved workforce, new African captives were brought to the French colony. And in the late 18th century, the majority of enslaved people had been born on the African continent. Most of these captives came from the Bight of Benin in West Central Africa, areas that today correspond to Benin, Togo, Nigeria, Angola, the Congo, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Women were minorities in the transatlantic slave trade, just to note, but approaching 1791, they were just nearly half of the enslaved population, okay? So while free people of color were often, while free women of color in particular were often economically independent as traders, real estate owners, and at times enslavers themselves, Africa-born women especially were the backbone of the slave-based economy, laboring alongside men cutting and processing sugarcane, and working in coffee and indigo plantations. They were expected to work through and shortly after their pregnancies and were brutally mistreated when they rebelled or at the whims of plantation owners and managers. So if we want to begin to understand enslaved women's life ways prior to and during the Haitian Revolution, I believe that we have to interrogate the norms, values, and behaviors and roles that African women embodied in their homelands. By recovering African women's histories, we can piece together their economic, militaristic, political, and religious activities that predated and contributed to the revolutionary events in Haiti. We know that victims of the transatlantic slave trade did not simply forget or abandon their African identities, beliefs, and practices once they disembarked in the Americas. Rather, they reassembled and reformulated what they knew and did in their homelands and translated these ideas and behaviors into new contexts. In the Dahomey Kingdom at the Bight of Benin, there was a military body of women referred to by outsiders as the quote unquote Amazons, who from as early as the 17th century served the king of Dahomey as his personal security and in warfare. And there's an image on the left of one of those women soldiers. Also in the Dahomey Kingdom and other West African polities, women were central politically and religiously, serving as queen mothers who counseled and advised kings and provided spiritual guidance for the kingdom. At the West Central African coast, queens like Donna Beatrice and Queen Nzinga not only headed their respective kingdoms, but also led movements to oppose the disruptive social, economic, and political forces connected to the transatlantic slave trade and European colonialism. Additionally, women in various African societies also were central spiritual figures, such as healers and midwives, and they were indispensable economic producers who performed the agricultural labor that sustained their communities. So this African perspective is key when investigating women's roles in colonial Haiti. There are also some fictional accounts that can help bring to life the stories of women in colonial Haiti. Both the infamous Rosalie by Evelyn Trujillo and Isabel Allende's Island Beneath the Sea give narratives of young enslaved girls who end up swept up in the Haitian Revolution. In both books, we see these young women navigate their worlds and encounter the clandestine networks that eventually made up the revolutionary force. These networks were composed of enslaved people and runaway Maroons who helped to organize the masses of enslaved people across various plantations, as well as the ritual leaders who used their spiritual tools and technologies to invoke the power of African deities to strengthen and protect the rebels in warfare. So now that we have a sense of the perspectives that help us better understand what types of contributions enslaved women made during the Haitian Revolution, we can turn to the handful of women who do appear in the archive and assume that these figures were really only but a few of the masses of women who took up arms or otherwise actively struggled for their liberation. We have women who were married to military officers and seem to have participated in the struggle against slavery and colonialism alongside their spouses, especially when French forces under the leadership of Victoire Leclerc returned to the colony in 1802, aiming to restore slavery. Sanit and Charles Belair, who was nephew of Toussaint Louverture, were captured and executed in the last days of the Leclerc expedition. According to CLR James, at the Battle of Crita-Pierrot, an important turning point in the final struggle against Leclerc's forces, a woman named Marie-Jeanne Lamartiniere accompanied her husband and, quote, took her fair share in the defense, end quote. On the other hand, Claire Hirouz, the wife of Jean-Jacques Dessalines, was described as having been sympathetic toward opposing forces and attempted to save some French individuals who were scheduled for execution. Then after Dessalines was executed in 1806, a woman named Dedi Basile recovered his butchered remains and buried him. So it's said that she has been a consistent presence in Dessalines' military camp and was loyal to him even after he faced betrayal by surrounding officers. We can also look to the ways that women translated cultural and religious knowledge and practices into political power to facilitate liberation from oppression. So the religious system, now known as Haitian Vodou, is based on human relationships to West and West Central African spirit forces who at times intervene in human affairs at the behest of adherents. Women are central figures in Vodou, contemporarily and historically, as mambo, which is a term for priestesses, their presence is key to spiritual efficacy. So things can't work without the women, right? So historically, we see that enslaved women use their ritual practices and relationships to spirits to enhance the power of the revolutionary masses. The most well-known example of the intersection of African-based religion and revolution, I think, is the Bois Cayman ceremony, a gathering of the rebels that occurred only 1 week before the August 1791 uprising. Oral histories and other sources identified Cécile Fatiman as a mambo or a voodoo priestess, as the main presider during the ceremony that sacralized the Haitian Revolution. Other Vodou queens, like a young girl named Princess Amethyst, accompanied and offered sacred protections to the male rebels. In the South, formerly enslaved women whose work as agricultural cultivators helped to economically sustain the colony during the height of the revolution. And we know that they come into the record for having protested unfair working conditions and unequal pay between them and their male counterparts. And then there's also records alluding to women acting as spies, smugglers, and nurses for the male rebels. How were women, so this leads to the question, how were women able to navigate the colony's landscape, secure resources, and connect rebel armies across plantations? Scholars like Carolyn Fick have argued that while women did not join fugitive maroon communities at the same rates as men, women took temporary leave from plantations and used their time away to traverse plantations and spread the word and organizational plans for the revolt. Since runaway Maroons are my primary areas of interest, I'm going to discuss two women, Charlotte Papillon and Magdalene, whose partners were central leaders during the Haitian Revolution, Jean-Francois Papillon and Hyacinthe Ducoudray. Advertisements for both Charlotte and Magdalene suggest that these women escaped their owners in the months leading up to the 1791 revolt and may have helped to organize the rebellion. And before I move to that, I do want to just kind of make a note that there is a Haitian scholar named Baina Bello, who also has done a lot of work, not just in terms of the historical archive, but in terms of oral histories about women in the Haitian Revolution. And so she's someone who has a depth of knowledge about some of the women who even English-speaking writers are unfamiliar with. Okay. So first we see Magdalene, who escaped sometime in the summer of 1790 and was believed to have been accompanying Hyacinth, who was a ritual leader who in 1792 was at the head of 15,000 rebels in Croix-du-Bouquet near Port-au-Prince. One primary source by Colonel Malenfant indicated that the women in Hyacinth's camp commonly ran errands to exchange weapons and food. So we see in this advertisement, Magdalene possibly fulfilling the role as a mobilizer before the Haitian Revolution uprisings. I mean, the ad even specifically names Hyacinth as having, lured her away from the plantation. So in this advertisement, Magdalene also transgressed gender norms by dressing in men's clothes, perhaps not only to disguise herself as a free person, but to conceal her active participation in helping to organize the uprisings that later occurred in the Western Department. Similarly, we have Charlotte, a Poulard woman from the Senegambia region, who escaped the Papillon plantation in March 1791, three and a half years after her partner, Jean-Francois Papillon, made his escape. So it was suspected that Charlotte was abusing the temporary pass that she had been given and was moving about in different quarters. So by the time this advertisement was posted in August of 1791, August 6th, it was believed that she was somewhere in or around Port-au-Prince, as the ad states. So we might never know exactly what Charlotte or exactly what Magdalene were doing during their time away. But in these 5 months that Charlotte had escaped, we can see that she was visiting different areas of the colony, but we don't necessarily know exactly where she went or with whom she was in contact. However, it is possible that she left in the spring on behalf of Jean-Francois to help coordinate the rebellions that would begin a few months later. While Charlotte was traveling in the greater Port-au-Prince area, smaller uprisings began there in July that anticipated the August 1791 mass revolt in the Northern Plain. So by the following September, she was back north with Jean-Francois, and rebels at the former Galliffet plantation had named them King and Queen. So this election of kings and queens was common among the rebels whenever they gained military control of a parish or a region. So in such a case, we might even consider Charlotte's crowning as a reward in part for her role in coordinating the northern and western revolts. So the silences around women in the Haitian Revolution require careful investigation into the archives to restore those women's voices. On the other hand, it is also important to ask other questions, such as what was the impact of the Haitian Revolution on women and children? So men made up the majority of the casualties during the Haitian Revolution armed struggle. And so women were still relegated to performing agricultural work and economically upholding the nation. Scholar Mimi Scheller has observed that these gender dynamics have led to a kind of masculinist, militaristic interpretation of Haiti's political history that devalues women in their work and societal contributions in the making of the modern nation of Haiti. This narrative needs to be problematized, not only because, as some scholars have found, women actually, because of the casualties during the revolution, in some of the earliest post-independence censuses, women were actually the majority of the population for a time. And so these narratives need to be inclusive of women in order to kind of get the fullest sense of of what post-independence Haiti looked like and the roles that women played. And to recenter women as the potomitan, or the pillars of their communities, as well as pillars of their families and pillars of the economy, and in collective efforts of transformational change in Haitian society. So that is all I have for today. Thank you for your time and attention, and I look forward to any questions or comments.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Crystal. Dr. Eddins. Open it up to a Q&A with Dr. Eddins. So if anyone has a question, please feel free to either turn off your video and unmute yourself and ask directly, or you're more than welcome to put it in the chat if you're more comfortable with that format as well.
Hi, Dr. Eddins. Thank you for your lecture and your work. I know this is geared towards secondary and high school age students. I teach elementary school, and I'm also just that they don't have to really. I can be interested on this apart from my own profession, but I don't. What do you think that elementary schoolers need to, in the United States, need to know about this information? Like what's the, there's so much to dive into, so.
Wow, that's a great question. Thank you. I don't think that it's probably ever really too early to start explaining some of the dynamics of how our contemporary society came into being. And I think that